Thank you for coming. I want to let you know that this is a coming-of-age memoir. So it's like, don't really know much about my father's business life, just in case anybody wants to get up and go. They're like, oh. This memoir took me a long time to write. Probably memoirs generally, or artistic projects. My guess is they often take a long time. But it took me a while because in the very beginning, I found myself sort of disappearing on the pages. And this is a coming-of-age memoir about a girl, me growing up in the 80s and 90s in California, Northern California, Silicon Valley, and against the backdrop of a complicated family. And so it was problematic if I wasn't showing up on the pages. I think, so some of the scenes would be kind of good. They'd have my parents, they'd have a little bit of action. I had to figure out, you have to write a scene, it turns out, if you're gonna write a memoir. I could write, but I wrote essays. And if you write an essay for this long, this is a 400-page book, you sort of lose everyone after page 10, I guess, because it's so condensed. So instead, I had to learn to write scenes, which mean that I'm letting you live in the moments of my past, I guess. But I was disappearing in them, and they were so the stakes of writing this memoir felt kind of high, because I think that the last thing I wanted to do was be a person, the child of a celebrity, essentially, and be writing a memoir, because a celebrity memoir, like, cringe. But I felt, I guess, that there was a kind of quality of disappearing in my own life, and that if I would write this book, I could write other books after, but I couldn't write those other books until I kind of solved this disappearing issue and this shame issue. It's almost like, in high school English, when you have to identify the themes of different books. And even though this is a nonfiction book, when I kind of condensed it down to its essence, there was a theme, and it was a kind of question of illegitimacy. Did I have a right to stand on the ground, my own story? Why did I have a right to sort of exist? And so in that sense, even though I'm saying it rather dramatically, I guess it's kind of universal, because I think that's a more common question. So what happened, the fix for the disappearance, I think, was that one of the inspirations is I read Tobias Wolff's This Boy's Life, and I noticed that it's a memoir, and I noticed that the more sort of naughty and devious and bad young Tobias was, the more I totally loved him. So I was like, oh, okay. So I started to access my character through noticing where I did things that were kind of shameful. And then as I wrote them, the scenes were pretty good, because they had life to them. And so then, I guess in that way, I sort of began to appear on the pages. So I'll start with, I'll read you from a little bit of the beginning of the book. This is a sort of terribly embarrassing story, which happened, obviously, of noticing that I was taking things. So like many of the stories in this book, I thought, oh God, I can't include it. But then ultimately it's in here. 3 months before he died, I began to steal things from my father's house. I wandered around barefoot and slipped objects into my pockets. I took blush, toothpaste, 2 chipped finger bowls in Celadon blue, a bottle of nail polish, a pair of worn patent leather ballet slippers, and 4 faded white pillowcases, the color of old teeth. After stealing each item, I felt sated. I promised myself that this would be the last time, but soon the urge to take something else would arrive again, like thirst. I tiptoed into my father's room, careful to step over the creaky floorboard at the entrance. This room had been his study when he could still climb the stairs, but he slept here now. It was cluttered with books and mail and bottles of medicine, glass apples, wooden apples, awards and magazines and stacks of paper. There were framed prints by Hasui of twilight and sunset at temples. A patch of pink light stretched out on a wall beside him. He was propped up in bed, wearing shorts. His legs were bare and thin as arms, bent up like a grasshopper's. "Hey, Lise," he said. Segyu Rinpoche stood beside him. He'd been around recently when I came to visit. A short Brazilian man with sparkling brown eyes, the Rinpoche was a Buddhist monk with a scratchy voice who wore brown robes over a round belly. We call him by his title. Tibetan holy men were sometimes born in the West now, in places like Brazil. To me, he didn't seem holy. He wasn't distant or inscrutable. Near us, a black canvas bag of nutrients hummed with a motor and a pump, the tube disappearing somewhere under my father's sheets. It's a good idea to touch his feet, the Rinpoche said, putting his hands around my father's foot in the bed, like this. I didn't know if the foot touching was supposed to be for my father, or for me, or for both of us. Okay, I said, and took his other foot in its thick sock, even though it was strange, watching my father's face, because when he winced in pain or anger, it looked similar to when he started to smile. That feels good, my father said, closing his eyes. I glanced at the chest of drawers beside him and at the shelves on the other side of the room for objects I wanted, even though I knew I wouldn't dare steal something out right in front of him. While he slept, I wandered through the house looking for I didn't know what. A nurse sat on the couch in the living room, her hands on her lap, listening for my father to call out for help. The house was quiet, the sounds muffled, the white-painted brick walls were dimpled like cushions. In the cabinet of the half-bath near the kitchen, where there used to be a tattered copy of the Bhagavad Gita, I found a bottle of expensive rose facial mist. With the door closed, the light out, sitting on the toilet seat, I sprayed it up into the air and closed my eyes. The mist fell around me, cool and holy, as in a forest or an old stone church. There was also a tube of silver lip gloss with a brush at one end and a twisting mechanism at the other that released liquid into the center of the brush. I had to have it. I stuffed the lip gloss into my pocket to take back to the one-bedroom apartment in Greenwich Village that I shared with my boyfriend, where I knew, as much as I have ever known anything, that this tube of lip gloss would complete my life. Between avoiding the housekeeper, my brother and sisters, and my stepmother around the house so I wouldn't be caught stealing things, or hurt when they didn't acknowledge me or reply to my hellos, and spraying myself in the darkened bathroom to feel less like I was disappearing. Because inside the falling mist, I had a sense of having an outline again. Making efforts to see my sick father in his room began to feel like a burden, a nuisance. For the past year, I'd visited every weekend, every other month or so. I'd given up on the possibility of a grand reconciliation, the kind in movies, but I kept coming anyway. Before I said goodbye, I went to the bathroom to mist one more time. The spray was natural, which meant that over the course of a few minutes, it no longer smelled sharp like roses, but fetid and stinky like a swamp, although I didn't know it at the time. As I came into his room, he was getting into a standing position. I watched him gather both of his legs in one arm, twist himself 90 degrees by pushing against the headboard with the other arm, and then use both arms to hoist his own legs over the edge of the bed and onto the floor. When we hugged, I could feel his vertebrae, his ribs. He smelled musty, like medicine sweat. I'll be back soon, I said. We detached, and I started walking away. Lise? Yeah? You smell like a toilet. It was the rose spray. And this is one scene of many. I actually returned all the things. I did. This is not a story of theft. Although I did like the idea of theft as a kind of metaphor for what I was doing. There's a terror when you're writing a memoir because even if you want to write about yourself, you find that you have just yourself. You find that you necessarily pull all these other people up into your net. And so you have a responsibility to do the best job with them you can, to be kind and to be honest and to try to capture some element of their character, at least as it relates to your own life. But sometimes you aren't able to capture necessarily the fullness of everyone's character. You're capturing how they're interesting to you, and you're using them in a certain way to tell an emotional story of yourself. But I did get an email once from my mother's ex-boyfriend, and the email was titled Correction. And I thought, oh no. And I went into it, and he said that there was a person named Ron in my book, and perhaps I had described him, and that this person named Ron in my book had many similarities to this boyfriend who was also named Ron, in that they both worked for NASA and that they both had dated my mother at a certain point. But that I described this person, who clearly wasn't him, as sort of having hair tufted on the sides like a clown, and having a sort of totally shiny bald head and walking with his feet splayed out and having lips like a fish. I thought, oh God. And so he said, I've attached a photograph of myself for further reference if you do want to describe me. And he had a picture of Fabio. But then I thought, oh no, why have I described this man who was quite wonderful in this sort of not very flattering way? And then I thought back on that scene and I realized, oh, well, it was because I was meeting him for the very first time. He just started dating my mother, and I felt possessive of my mother, and I wasn't sure I liked him so much. And so that's why I had described him that way. Now that I've already described myself in a sort of compromised way, the only way I felt like I had permission to describe other people the way that they were, and with all of their eccentricities, is I had to describe my own. The other thing I can say right now, I'm just worried that in my scatterbrainness I'll forget later, is something like, I'm trying to give people the chance to have their own story within the pages of my story. So I think different people take different things from this book. They have different relationships with their parents, and they had different coming-of-age stories. And it's been sort of a victory to me, this idea that I've brought up people's pasts for themselves, because they've come up to me at readings and they've said, oh, that feels exactly like me, I'm a single mother. Or they've said, oh, my father was like that, he would make jokes like that, or he was difficult like that. And I've noticed that if you read a book at a certain point in your life, maybe a book that you love, and then you wait 10 years and you read it again, it's almost like it's a totally different book. And I have the feeling it's not the book that changed. I think it's that we continuously change, and then art hopefully reflects our own changes back to us. So I think that it's sort of a difficult thing, because this book that I wrote about my family is now everyone else's book. It's not mine anymore. And I have to kind of release it and say, whatever you get out of it, it's what you're supposed to get out of it, because it's your book now. Of course, that's a little difficult because it's my family, and sometimes I want to say, no, that's not what I meant. But that doesn't really matter anymore. But without further ado, the Ron story. Since she'd become interested in Ron, she no longer paid attention to me as astutely, I thought. She no longer consulted the I Ching. She was half absent with happiness, the same slight smile on her lips as when she ran up the hill to get the prickly pear. It was between boyfriends, between the loneliness and despair that followed one, and the lift that began the next, where I hoped to stay forever, she and I the only team, the real couple. On the night of the date, Ron arrived on time. She was leaning over the bathroom sink doing her makeup when he knocked. I ran to open the door. I saw right away that Ron wasn't a hippie. He was bald, with hair tufted on the side like a clown's, and had wide, bushy eyebrows, glasses rimmed with gold, and large, swollen lips like a fish. He looked clean and smelled of soap and detergent. "Hello," I said. "I'm Lisa. My mom's getting ready." "Nice to meet you," he said, holding out his hand. He followed me into the living room. I noticed that as he walked, his feet splayed out dramatically to either side. My mother called from the bathroom, "I'll be out in a minute." As we passed the bookshelf, I reached for the album of photographs of my birth. This was unplanned. It surprised even me, one arm jutting out as if I didn't have control of my limbs, and pulled it out of its socket on the shelf. I was 7 years old at this point. I'd asked her to get rid of this album many times, and she refused, bringing it with us as we moved from house to house. That cover was made of brown woven grasses, and because it was old, the grasses had started to fray at the edges. To me, too, this hinted at the shame of the contents. I suspected other children didn't have shameful books like this around in their houses. He and I sat down on the flowered couch beside each other. "I want to show you something," I said. "Just some photos of my mother and me." I opened the book across my lap where he could see it. My mother, younger, lying on a bed with long hair like dark water pooling around her face. These were the pictures of my birth, in black and white, with rounded corners. She had what looked like a man's shirt buttoned around her chest, and she was naked from the waist down, with her legs bent and open in the foreground of the photo. I turned the page. There I was, emerging from between her glowing white legs, like a turtle rising up from a pond. In the following pictures, once I was out, you could see my body wrinkled, my face wax white, asymmetrical, and squished. I felt revulsion and disgust, and yet I continued to turn the pages. I would not have known how to articulate it. I wanted to disgust him the way I was disgusted, to scare him away, to show him who we were, so that he might leave now rather than wait. "And here's more," I said in my sweetest voice. "Yes," he said, I see. He made no motion to rise and run. He sat, glancing at the pages and then looking away, as if distracted. When my mother came out of the bathroom and saw us, she snatched the album from my hands and stuck it back in its place on the shelf, giving me a furious look. So I think one of the things also that I'm trying to do with this book is to get so particular about my life that in some ways it gets universal. So that people, I think that the Steve Jobs thing can be quite distracting and people think, oh, my life must be so different. But then when they read it, it's not so different. Usually people have complicated people that they love, and they have sort of bumps in the road of coming of age. And I think in some ways the contrasts are quite high in this book, in my story. But the more I hear from other people, and the more I, and because I know people and have friends and love people, I know that people also have stories like this, even if they don't have the same degree of notoriety, I guess. But I had to use people in my life that I loved to stand in for other things. And I was doing a reading actually at my old high school where everyone who was in this memoir was there. It was kind of terrifying. And including my ex-boyfriend, my high school boyfriend, who I wrote some things about him. And I think, he's certainly a more interesting person than on these pages. On these pages, he's kind of like in relation to me. But what I was thinking about his character in the book is that he kind of stands for California. Falling in love with him is a way of explaining the Bay Area where I grew up. And I'm sure I imagine lots of you have been to the Bay Area because Google. And actually, I guess Google started in the garage of my journalism teacher. And she ran the paper in my high school, and it hadn't started yet. It was a twinkle in someone's eye, I guess. But it was just about to start in these pages, although I didn't know. But anyway, this isn't a story about Google. This is a story about me. So so this is the story of high school and the Bay Area. And I was writing this book from the cold wilds of Brooklyn and imagining sunshine and imagining air that had perfume in it of eucalyptus and bay laurel and, the grasses on the hills. And it was a nice place to live for a long time. Now I'm going to have to actually go back to Brooklyn and live in Brooklyn. But it was a nice way to time travel, spend time with my young parents, and sort of travel through space and be in the Bay Area again, which is so beautiful. On the way home from another visit to my school, to the school, my father suggested that we stop at Palo Alto High School, Pali for short, just to see what it was like. It was late in the afternoon and school was out. For a few minutes we walked around the empty quad. Many of the buildings looked like bunkers. I felt uncomfortable, as if we were trespassing. But then we heard music coming from somewhere, and we followed it over to where a tall boy was standing beside the door, where the music was coming from. I was too shy to speak, but my father asked, "What's going on in here?" And the boy said, "It's the paper," and we peered into the room. There were lots of people inside working on computers and lounging on beanbags, and I thought, if I did decide to go here, I'd work on the paper too. "You know what's great about going to school nearby your house?" my father asked as we left. "You can walk to it, like I did. And if you walk a lot, over the course of time, you get to see the seasons change." He said it in the same slow way he spoke of beautiful women, but walking to school didn't sound very romantic to me. Nonetheless, I go to the school, and now I'm in my senior year. In my senior year at Pali, I was elected to the position of editor-in-chief of the paper. One day, in the middle of the week, there were technical problems. The computer systems crashed. The screens went dark. The printer became inaccessible. If the computers no longer operated and would not reboot, days of work would be lost. All our carefully designed pages. Josh, his dirty blonde hair the color of a sand dune, worn in a thick ponytail, lay down on the floor to inspect and arrange the wires. The rest of us mulled in a daze of terror and tragedy. "Do you want to come?" he asked me, about a trip to his house to get a missing cord. I noticed Josh more closely now, dimples when he smiled, wide shoulders beneath flannel shirts. He was shy and friendly and had loose, complicated handwriting, like the bouncing string of a kite. "Sure," I said. not knowing then that he lived in Portola Valley, 20 minutes away. He seemed to me sloppy, too relaxed, shambolic. He could fix computers, but he was disorganized, forgetting to do his assignments for Mrs. Paw's English class, whereas I was meticulous, a grade grubber. He never arrived anywhere on time, and he was hopeless with a calendar, wouldn't have his homework and scrambled to do it in the minutes before class. Later, I would find out that he was taking applied mathematics and differential equations at Stanford, and he would be admitted to college at Stanford and MIT, so he was clearly fine. He drove a used '83 Toyota Supra in incandescent teal with a pink sine wave painted along both sides. "Sorry about the paint job," he said as we got in. He bought it used from a female physicist in Livermore. He had nice hands on the steering wheel. His room had a mattress on the floor and a window looking out to a yard and the forest. There were papers and books strewn around, a stack of stereo equipment and headphones. It was large enough to seem empty and cluttered at the same time. He found the cord, and we left. On the way back, we turned onto a rastradero, a 2-lane road, rough and patched, that wound beside a nature preserve. "I'm going to show you a secret," he said. "Hold on." The speed limit was 25. He began to accelerate. We advanced toward a blind corner where the road rose up and then disappeared, a hill on one side, a drop on the other. The road curled back on itself around the hill, out of sight. Another car might be advancing toward us and smash into us at the bend. A family of deer might be walking across. He continued to build speed, shifting up, third, fourth, fifth. The car rumbled and whined. "Are you sure you should be?" "Don't worry," he yelled. "I've done it before." My mother sometimes said, "There are guardian angels just for teenagers." Oh, help me, God of teenagers, I thought. Oh, God of teenagers. "Hold on," he yelled. The car scraped. The gears sang. I gripped the top of the seatbelt in one hand, the door handle in the other. He shifted again, peeled around the blind curve, and then we flew. It was because of the uneven road, a raised portion followed by a long dip downhill. If you got up enough speed, you could catch the lip of the up and fly over the concavity, through the dots of light cast by the row of emerald trees and bushes growing alongside the road. For me, the flight unlidded the town. There were hidden places of freedom, and he knew them. And then we're dating. Sometimes in the late afternoon after school, during the weeks when we were not producing the newspaper, Josh and I went to Windy Hill Preserve, up above Skyline, hills wide and yellow and soft like the humps of camels. On one side, more hills like a blanket thrown out into the wind all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The town was a miniature below us, silent and still except for the singing, rasping wind that flattened the tall grasses. A clear day, too much to take in. The glassy air and the feeling of great freedom and grace, the world opening. I looked north and I could see San Francisco sparkling in the distance. It was both close and far away, something to do with the angle of this hill to those hills, the refraction of the light. That's how I felt about my parents now that Josh was around. Not that I didn't worry about my mom or my father or what would happen when he realized that I was really leaving for college. I was simply hovering above it all, so it didn't pinch or press. Now Josh was the one who drove me to doctor's appointments or between houses. He did not keep a calendar, forgot about work assignments and missed dentist appointments and other appointments, but never the ones with me. I was protected inside his teal Supra. After the spring rains, when the grasses came up out of the clods of dirt under the oak and eucalyptus trees around Stanford, viridian fuzz like whiskers, stripes of gold light in long, bright ribbons, I thought, this is my town. I walked home after school and noticed the seasons change. Before this, it was my father's town or my mother's town, or the town where I'd been placed by accident and shifted around. Now I was in love, and the land was dimensional and heavy and particulate. It belonged to me. Thank you.
Thanks. That was awesome. Thank you for the readings. They were really great. When you think about your dad, how would you describe him?
It's hard to sum it up so quickly. Very human, I would say. It was interesting. I was talking about time traveling. One thing you get to do when you're writing a memoir is you get to go and hang out, at least I did, you get to go and hang out with your parents when they're younger than you are now. So you get to notice that they're human. And one thing that I noticed was that, so my father wasn't really around when I was very little. I was unexpected, unwanted, and my parents were both so young. And his career trajectory was just beginning then, and really starting to ramp up as far as I understand. So he wasn't around, and then at a certain point, he must have made a pretty clear decision to come back and be a part of my life. And I think for me at the time, and you'll see in the book, it was very awkward. We wanted to get to know each other, but I think he was very young and didn't really know how to be with kids. And I had been dreaming of him for so long that it was like I wanted him to arrive on the scene with a real bam. And he was, in some ways, the dream father, in the sense of being the father you dream about when you don't have one. He was famous, and he was rich, and he was incredibly charismatic, and he was handsome, and he drove a Porsche. And so it was kind of like this realer than real, larger than life arrival. But in another way, it was disappointing because he was so awkward. There were these long pauses. And I went back as a part of this book and watched this next presentation. It was the introduction to the next, I think, at Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco. And I had already written about it, but I wanted to watch the presentation because I wanted to make sure that what I'd remembered was correct. And I'm not really a Steve Jobs completionist, so I don't really watch his old presentations. I was there at some of them, and the other ones, he was my father, not this figure. But I got myself to watch the presentation, and I'd remembered looking at him from the perspective of a daughter and him being kind of amazing and larger than life. And then when I watched the presentation again on YouTube, he was incredible. I was like, oh, wow, he really was incredible. This wasn't just the perspective of a daughter. He seemed so at ease in front of so many people, and so I guess this is just kind of a terrible word, but so relatable, so simple and human at the same time as being so sparkling and incredible. And so set against our personal interactions when we were getting to know each other, we were, the first time I was going to stay at his house overnight because my mother was taking a class, and I went to his company and waited for him for a while, and then we got in his car, in his amazing Porsche, and drove to his mansion. And the whole drive, he didn't say a word. So, and at the time I thought, maybe it was something I did, or maybe if I had been more of a conversationalist, or maybe he was mad at me. And I realized, looking back as an adult, spending time with this young, awkward man, that he actually just was kind of doing his best, and he was quite human. So it was wonderful to have certain revelations like that, to give myself the permission to understand who he might have been as a father and a person, and where he might have been coming from as a complicated and incomplete person as we all are. I hope that answers your question. I'm the last person to talk about his work life, right? So
I feel like when you look back at your childhood, a lot of people have patchy memories or may have remembered something incorrectly that then somebody tells you the story later, an older adult that may have been there. So I'm wondering if you had more of those revelations as you were writing about them, things that you thought happened a certain way, and then as you started to describe them, you realized, actually, that's not at all what happened. Did you have moments like that, and what was one that was interesting?
I'm sure I did have moments like that. So what happens is, it's really hard to remember so many things from your life, and I wasn't sure at the beginning I had enough memory to write a whole book about my childhood. It's a coming-of-age book, so it ends when I leave for college, and I was terrified. But it turns out when you start to sit down and think and work at it and write, something about writing also helps. You get one story, and then another one connects to that story, and then another one connects. And after a while, you have a whole constellation of stories. And if you kind of pull this end kind of trembles. So that I probably wrote 7 books for this book. stories that helped me get to a place, but that in the end weren't necessary, didn't merit inclusion. And I'm looking for the stories in my life that stand for several things. Maybe stories that are kind of metaphors as well. And there was one time, my father used to always say, "Lise, you're going to remember this." And I thought, what am I, the record keeper? But also I thought, oh God, I hope I remember. Why would I remember this particular moment? Because some of the moments were very poignant perhaps for him, and they weren't for me. And so I didn't quite understand what was going on. And there was one moment when we were on a vacation in Hawaii. I think I was maybe 9. And he'd been, especially when I looked at this book and researched it, I understood he'd been wavering back and forth about his paternity. It had been proven by a DNA test, but he still was saying he wasn't my father in public and to other people in private. But there was this moment when we were in Hawaii, and I do remember him sort of pointing out body parts and saying, "Look, we have the same this, and we have the same this." And I remember he wanted to sort of sit there for a while, and his arm around my waist kind of felt like a seat belt, because I wanted to run and leap and jump to the desserts table. And I thought, why is he keeping me this heaviness? And I talked with his ex-girlfriend, Tina, and she remembered that time too with a little more clarity. And she also was telling me that he was even saying to her that he wasn't necessarily my father. And it was at that moment, because she was there too, that she saw that he was kind of claiming me. And so I had remembered some part of that moment from my child's perspective. But the full import of that scene was not apparent until I went back and did some research and understood kind of what was really going on. And it was wonderful to be able to layer my childhood memories and feelings and desires and longings with the woman that I am now, who knows so much more about people and who can understand more of what's going on. It was like I could sort of keep my child self company. So the times, I don't know if it happens for you guys, but like sometimes things happen when you're a kid and you don't know what they mean. And so it's those things that you keep and preserve and bring forward into your adulthood. Maybe because you hope at some point you'll have the information and the wisdom and the knowledge to be able to sort of open up those mysteries and make sense of them later. And so the process of writing really was a process of opening up all these long closed boxes and seeing what was inside. And sometimes what was inside was kind of a run-of-the-mill story. And sometimes what was inside was more than I had anticipated, and changed my own perspective of my past. And I guess I do hope to do that for other people reading the book. Also, I hope to maybe change other people's perspective or deepen their own awareness or their memories of their own past. I think it's definitely happened for people who grew up in California, because they're like, the smells, because I have so many smells in this book, maybe too many smells. But I think childhood also has a lot of these mysteries in it. There's a thing you do as a kid, I guess. You use anything you've got because you don't really have much. So remembering all the times I kind of subtly and not so subtly kind of tried to use my father's fame to prop myself up. How embarrassing is that? And then, trying to forgive that young person or be able to chuckle at the young person for doing whatever she could do and being scrappy. Yes?
So another funny connection. Your journalism teacher, I believe, Esther Wojcicki, one of whose daughters is YouTube CEO. Another daughter was married to Sergey Brin, I think, for a little while. To what extent were these connections to the rest of Silicon Valley, that connectedness, part of your life?
Google was beginning in her garage, I think around the time I was graduating, or maybe just about when I went to college, and I had just about no idea. So amazing things can be happening around you, and you cannot know about them, even if you're right in the epicenter of them. Or maybe I don't think anyone particularly knew. So yes, that was Waj, and I had an event. I was saying I had an event at my high school with Waj the other day, and almost everyone in the memoir was there, which I can tell you is kind of terrifying. But I'm relating to my story as the story of a girl with a father and a mother growing up in California at that time, not as the story of a titan or of a Silicon Valley guru. I get to talk about how Silicon Valley was because I lived it. But I certainly was not a part of the business aspect. I guess that's interesting in its own way. I remember coming back in college, and that was during the first .com boom, I think, and noticing that like every other car was a Ferrari and there were lots of high heels. And I'd never seen high heels in Palo Alto before that. So I was like, wow, what's happened to my place? And now going back, of course, it's vastly different. But this is, I think this is more of a story everyone can relate with, even though it has dramatic ups and downs. Yes.
You've talked about how you looked at your father and you were trying to kind of, from the outside, learn how he was feeling about being your father, like the thing with the arm. And I was wondering if you've ever actually had an open conversation with him about this, if you ever asked him why it was so difficult for him to accept that he is your father.
That's a good question. It was hard to talk with him about things like that. He said that he wasn't so good at communicating. And there was a kind of wonderful moment, the end of the book. I'd been waiting for this Hollywood moment. He was so sick. And I'd been waiting for some sort of moment of reconciliation. And of course, I knew I was an idiot, because when do you get those moments that are in the movies, right? When the person says, I'm sorry, or I understand how you felt, but still, I was waiting for it. So I kept on returning home, and I think that's why I was sort of pilfering these objects, because I felt things weren't complete. But I couldn't really get that conversation out of him, and I was terrified. When we had talked about it earlier, he'd said things like, just move on, or, he said at some point he was sorry, and he said he loved me, but it somehow wasn't enough for this, what felt like a kind of tidal wave of grief, actually, that we'd missed each other for so long. So when he was dying, I went back a month before, and finally we had a kind of amazing moment where he said, I really owe you one, over and over again, and it's such an odd phrase, I owe you one. He hadn't really said it before, and kept on wondering, what is the one? And he was also sad because he hadn't really spent the time, he said. And the problem with dying is, I guess, it's a kind of like a final end. So if you haven't spent the time before that happens, then it's too late, So that felt very meaningful. Like, oh, okay, we're on the same page. We missed something here. And I wish it had happened earlier, because it would have been nice to be friends. It would have been nice to have a feeling of that he had been sort of unburdened of this feeling earlier, so that we were on the same page, because we actually really liked each other and had some great times together. He was also really funny, and he was enjoyable to be with a lot. We had a lot of fun on our skates, and it felt like it was very lucky in some ways that I lived with him during high school, because even though, as you will see in the book, I am full on in the midst of adolescent angst, I realized if we hadn't lived together then, we wouldn't have gotten to know each other as well as we did. And that contains its own kind of resolution, because I guess if you know someone more as a person, their flaws become more understandable, and they perhaps become less personal, I guess. I did feel, and I write about this in the book, but I did feel that I've been hearing about sometimes people imitate my father by imitating his wardrobe, or they imitate maybe some of the ways he could be caustic and sharp and difficult and sometimes cruel. And from my experience, the sense that he had an extremely sensitive part, very dear, very kind, very simple, very caring. And it was from that part, as far as I could tell, by knowing some of his work colleagues and by knowing him to the degree that I did, it was from that part from which he created. And so I wondered if perhaps some of the imitations of the caustic part, if that part was the part that was protecting this ultra-sensitive core. And so if the imitations in that sense are a bit misguided.
Given that you and your dad didn't fully accept you as his kid until you were a little bit older, how did you deal with that reconciliation from your perspective, both when you were a kid and then as an adult when you had more perspective?
I think this book is going to answer so many of your questions, but in a subtle way. So I think I thought I'd gotten over it, sort of, because we had a lot of good times together, and he'd apologized, and we liked each other, and we used to tease each other. But then certain funny things kept on happening. Like, I was enraged that he wouldn't get a couch. We had chairs, we had places to sit. But my mother and I had been sort of nomadic. We'd been a little bit rootless. We'd been searching for home, and so we didn't really have a couch. We'd sort of taken one from him at some point, and then carted this sort of horrible couch around. But this feeling that he owed me a couch was so profound. So I would complain bitterly about the couches, and I felt so sad about it and so deeply owed and so enraged, disproportionate to what a couch actually is. And I think that my sense of grief about having lost him became blame, became anger, and would sort of attach itself to these odd objects. So in that sense, I think it took a while to understand, to get under the skin of my own sort of strange frustrations, and understand that loss might have been at the root of them, which was kind of another revelation of writing the book. Oh, right. Why was I so fixated on the couch? Oh, right. Because I hadn't had a father during all that time. I don't really tell you this in the book, but I think it becomes kind of clear. Did you want to ask a question too?
Sure. My interest, I guess, is do you have technology and use technology in your life? Like, do you have an iPhone or do you have an Android device? There's lots of folks here that work on a competitive product. And as a new mom, do you have a plan for how you're going to deal with technology with your kid?
First of all, I have an iPhone, and I'm slightly bitter because the new ones seem to be so large, and I have the smallest hands, and so they kind of it kind of slips a bit. So maybe I need to get an Android and solve that. No, I can say that. And I love the camera on the iPhone, and I wrote my book on an Apple, and I love it. But when I was writing, it was very difficult to interact with the sort of texting world while I was doing deeper work. It would sort of pull me out of profound thinking. So I would leave my phone at a cafe down the street. And I was actually dating at the time, which made it really difficult to date when you don't have a phone. But I would leave it at a cafe, and they would hold it for me, and which is so odd, right? Sometimes for days at a time, because sometimes you get to a hard place in your writing, and you realize you're writing really badly, and it feels like if you look at your phone and you can text with your friends, or you can look at some article that you've sort of solved the problem, but in fact you haven't. You kind of have to sit with the misery of your own bad sentences for a while. They've become good, but they started bad because I didn't know where I was coming from. So hiding away my phone was very useful, and sort of turning off the internet for a while was useful. So the relationship I have with my devices is close but intermittent. And I've tried when I'm nursing and when I'm with my son not to be on the phone, and me and our babysitter have talked about trying not to do that so much when we're with him, because it feels as if you're giving someone concentrated attention, but of course you're not. And I find the easiest solution is to kind of get rid of it from he's crying. He's like, sorry, that's my son. So I'm hoping for future books it's not so fraught, that I'm able to put my phone in the other room and ignore it for a while. But I found with this book I had to either leave it at a cafe or later lock it in a food addictions box, for a time, which you can get on Amazon, actually. Probably other places, too. So I wouldn't say love-hate, but intermittent and close, maybe. Yes.
So I was thinking about this. You and your family, and especially your father, have been portrayed numerous times in like film and television. And have you paid attention to any of this? It must be weird. Like, how do you feel about it? Just in general, thoughts?
I sort of assiduously avoid it. I didn't see the Sorkin movie, and I didn't read the Isaacson biography, and I don't read the books about my father. I figure like there's a scene in Pee-wee's Big Adventure. My dad and I used to watch that, and they make a movie about Pee-wee at the end of his Big Adventure, and Dottie, his friend, says, "Pee-wee, aren't you going to watch your movie?" And he says, "I don't have to, Dottie. I lived it." So something like that. But also I was working on a book, and I thought, sometimes you can look at a picture and it informs your own memory. You stop remembering what you remember and you start remembering the picture. And I felt it was very important to not interact with other people's interpretations of my father's life with me as a kind of bit character. Because it was already a courageous act to decide I got to be a main character. I mean, I think people will sometimes pick up this book thinking that they're getting a book about Steve Jobs, and they will be plunged into the coming-of-age sagas of a girl, which I think is wonderful. Maybe it's a book some people wouldn't normally buy. But I'm actually finding men are liking it a lot, too, which I was hoping for and which surprises me, because it is so specifically about a woman or a girl. But yeah, I kind of don't interact with them. And I don't have difficulty avoiding press. Like even during this book tour, I've kind of had to keep my equanimity, and the way I've done that is by not reading any reviews or press. Because when I think of it, I sort of get a pit in my stomach. It's hard to be part of another person's narrative, which is part of the reason I felt like heavy-hearted about writing my own narrative, because other people would be a part of it. And I've done the best I could with it. And I think we do have the right to write our own stories or to come to terms with our own stories, but we don't necessarily have the obligation to participate in the stories of others.
I have like 3 daughters, and
Yeah.
I'm pretty comfortable with like my own passion for technology. I don't really share much of that with them, so I'm just kind of wondering, like, you having a father who's very passionate about technology, like, what were your common grounds? Like, how did you connect with each other on, like, I mean, because we have our things we do, because I know they're not interested in all of my technology enthusiasm.
You're like, gadgets? No. More gadgets? No. Yeah, I think people are looking for connection and love and humor from their parents and their fathers. And the gadgets are such a means to something, right? They're not an end. And they certainly don't replace human contact, would be my thought. So my father was, when he was on his game, totally delightful to hang out with, because he was interested and curious about a ton of things. And I guess the way technology is the best, from my perspective, is that it can help with that kind of curiosity and that kind of investigation. But it doesn't replace curiosity or hanging out together or spending time together. And I think, in my experience of my father, he was not an exception to that. He did not seem gadget obsessed. He knew that I wasn't, going to talk with him for hours about the iPhone. So we would take skates and talk about roses and talk about architecture and talk about fonts and talk about Palo Alto. And he seemed very interested in those things. And I guess interest and curiosity are infectious. So I think you're doing great. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.